Welcome to Resilience in the Shadows, the podcast by TentMakers of Louisiana. I'm your host, Alex Payton, joined by my co-host and mom, Letitia Payton, executive director and co-founder of TentMakers of Louisiana. Today, we welcome our special guest, Kristi Schubert, trial attorney and advocate for survivors. Kristi brings hope and justice to survivors of sexual abuse and exploitation. She has dedicated her career to representing survivors of trauma with compassion, resilience, and a focus on their well-being. Her legal expertise spans cases including rape, child molestation, sex trafficking, and institutional abuse. She ensures survivors feel heard and supported throughout their legal journey. Beyond her legal work, Kristi is a passionate educator and advocate. She frequently shares her knowledge on survivor representation, victims' rights, and securing justice. Her contributions have earned her recognition as a leader in her field. In this episode, we will address frequently asked questions and key terms survivors and supporters should understand, such as survivor language, grooming, institutional abuse, and the differences between civil and criminal cases. Kristi, welcome back to Resilience in the Shadows. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Kristi, let's start by breaking down some important terms that people might hear in regards to sexual abuse and sexual abuse of children and things they may hear but not fully understand. And we know that sometimes people want to use soft language to describe some of the terms that really we should be using. So if we could get started maybe with just really some basic terms. What is child sexual abuse?
Sure. So it's the obvious things that people think of, raping a child, that's child sex abuse. Really any sexual touching of a child is sexual abuse. But it's also the things that aren't obvious to everybody. So for instance, showing a child pornographic material, that's child abuse. Exposing your genitals to a child and masturbating in front of them, that's child abuse, even though you didn't touch them. So it doesn't require a touching for it to be child sexual abuse. It's also actually in Louisiana and a lot of other places too, even if you are not the person actually perpetrating the child sexual abuse, or you're not the person who's doing the acts, if you are, quote, from the law specifically, aiding or tolerating somebody else sexually abusing a child, then you yourself are committing child sexual abuse by allowing that to happen.
And this is a word that's a little more vague, and I know there's lots of conversation specifically online and especially around the clerical sex abuse discussions. What is grooming?
So grooming is basically the process where an abuser both earns the trust of the child and also throughout that process tries to make it more likely that the child will never report what happened to them, or that if they do report, that the child won't be believed. It's usually kind of a multi-step process. Not every abuser does every single part of the steps, but what generally happens, kind of a classic grooming process would look like, step one, they target the victim. They tend to choose a victim that they think is in sort of a vulnerable position or doesn't have the resources to report them or to fight back. Step two would generally be that they would start creating trust between themselves and the victims, or between themselves and the victim's family. And again, like I'm using victim in this specific context. Once that's happened to somebody, we would normally use survivor. But in this context, what they feel they're doing is choosing a victim. So they target the victim, they start to create trust, and then after they've created some trust, they start to try to usually create some sort of dependency between themselves and the child so that the child feels dependent on them. And the purpose of that dependency is that it makes it very difficult for the child to do anything that would rock the boat, like reporting, or like telling people what's going on, or like saying, you are making me uncomfortable right now. So usually after that creating dependency stage, or sometimes before, they'll kind of mix up the stages a little bit. They'll usually start isolating the child, and that means they'll find ways to be alone with them. They might say, oh, well, I heard that you don't have time to drive your kid to soccer practice. I'm happy to start doing that for you. Or, oh, I heard this thing came up, like I can watch the child for you while you have to go do that other thing. They'll find ways to get alone with the child. And what they'll often do next, particularly the ones who, the predators who end up getting away with it for the longest, they'll do this next stage where they create a sense of secrecy between themselves and the child. And that allows them to kind of test, is it okay for me, is it safe for me as a predator to take this from the level of, right now we're just acting as if I'm your mentor or close friend, but if I start taking it to a sexual level, can I trust that you won't report it to anybody or your parents? So they'll create like a sense of secrecy. They might say, oh, we have this secret nickname, or we have this secret game we play, don't tell anybody about it. And they can use that to test whether or not the child will actually keep it a secret. And if the child does keep it a secret, then they feel like they have some better, a better chance that they'll be able to keep the actual molestation a secret overall. And once they feel that safety of knowing that there's a sense of secrecy between them and the child, and that the child will keep the secret, then often they'll, right from then on, will start sexualizing the relationship.
Kristi, a follow-up here, actually 2 questions. Number one, we see in lots of instances, especially in the Catholic Church, the use of the word boundary violation. And a lot of times they'll use boundary violation and you find out that the priest or the employee asked something inappropriate, which kind of makes sense as a boundary violation. But then other times you'll figure out, well, he was touching the child, which is still, once again, a boundary violation. But why does the word boundary, why do you think the word boundary violation is the chosen word to label a lot of these? And then the second question, specifically when talking about grooming, you had mentioned secrets, not on a theological or philosophical level, but on a practical level. What role does confession in the Catholic Church play what role does it play in the creation of secrecy? Because most Catholic children start learning about confession and how it works and at around the age of, 7, and secrecy is a large part of that. You can come confess your sins and I will not even tell your parents. So those 2 questions, boundary violation, what role does confession play in setting up secrecy in clerical sex abuse situations?
Yeah, so the reason that the term boundary, you could almost just replace it with the word rules, interpersonal rules. And boundaries are important both because you want to have, as an organization, you want to have a set of boundaries that people need to abide by when interacting with each other. And also individuals have boundaries. And the thing about boundaries is that they help you delineate yourself from the other person and your autonomy from the other person's autonomy. And so if I have a personal boundary that's like, I don't like somebody to, lick certain fruit or something near me. Like, what if I just have a weird thing about that? I could say to somebody, like, that makes me really uncomfortable. Can you not do that around me? Or I'm going to leave, You're enforcing your own boundaries. It's a way for people to keep themselves safe within their zone and other people to not step into other people's zone and annoy them. And if somebody can't follow your boundaries, then you guys just kind of go your separate ways, and it's not a problem. Within organizations, it's really important specifically because when an organization can create a set of boundaries that basically says, this is the way that we believe it is appropriate for people to interact. And that set of boundaries can be created specifically for the purpose of preventing the stages of grooming. And so when somebody crosses one of those boundaries, then everybody else can say, whoa, that crosses the boundaries. And we're not saying that you are a child molester or that you're abusing anybody, but you're crossing the boundaries. And that's what groomers do. They always cross the boundaries. That's what the grooming process is about. It's about breaking down boundaries. And so an organization can create a whole set of boundaries that are appropriate for preventing grooming. And if they enforce those regularly for everybody, not just for people who think might be child abusers, but for everybody, then the entire organization is safer for children.
Kristi, just one little follow-up. I think you have a second part to answer for Alex, but I want to make sure we also understand that grooming also, it's predators will groom their victims, but they will also groom the family members or those closest to their victims.
Absolutely. So the grooming process, one of the main aims of it is to ensure either that you're not reported or that when you are reported that you're not, that the child is not believed. So you can basically train adults and others are like you can train the child's family or your coworkers or anybody else to see you as such a good person, deserving of so much trust that you must be believed. And that's basically how they groom a community or a family, is they train the family or the community to see them so positively that you would feel guilty for doubting that they have your best interest at heart.
I think that's important in creating an environment in which you would feel guilty at the very idea of thinking that maybe they did something wrong.
Right. Like abusers will often say this thing like, are you saying you don't trust me? Like you don't trust me? As if everybody in the world just deserves trust automatically, which I don't think is correct. I think trust is something that has to be earned. And it's something that in some sense is almost sacred in a way. I mean, I think it's in the Bible in Matthew where they say, don't throw your pearls to the swine. They will trample all over them and tear you to pieces. I think trust is pearls, and people are not expected or should not be expected to give them to just everybody that they see. Trust is something that's earned bit by bit by respecting boundaries step by step over time. But groomers and abusers want to jump those steps.
And going through terms here, here's another one that I know came up recently in the Father Martin's case, where he had put the girl's hair in his mouth, and the word consent kept coming up. I know I used it when talking about the case too. I said the girl did not consent. And that word has been used it's now politicized, unfortunately, as well. But a lot of people seem to have a problem with the word consent. What is consent, especially in the context of minors? What is consent?
In the context of minors, legally speaking, you cannot use consent as a defense to sexual interaction with a minor. That's what I'd say legally speaking. In general, though, what I'd say is there is no consent between an adult and a minor. People will always say, a lot of abusers will say, oh, this 14-year-old, they came on to me. It was them who were trying to do this, so it was consent. That is the wrong way to think about it. There is no situation where a healthy adult would see a child coming onto them and say, oh, okay, well, I guess it's okay then if the child wants this. If the child is trying to have sex with an adult, then there is some sort of problem going on with the child. I don't care if a child throws themselves at an adult, shows up in their bed naked. It is the adult's job to say, no, what is going on with you that you are feeling the need to try to have sex with an adult? I'm going to, get out of this situation, let your parents know, because obviously there's some sort of psychological issue going on. There just is no such thing as consent between an adult and a child. If you're an adult and you are conscious and not paralyzed, then it is your job to make sure that no sexual interaction goes on between you and a child.
Kristi, can you define what a child is? We're talking about consent, and and I've heard it many times where people say, well, she was 16, so she consented and then it was okay.
Yeah. So it gets very complicated with ages. In Louisiana, generally, the age of consent is 17, but it can be different for like criminal law versus civil law. And when you're talking about two people who are both under the age of 18, then there's what they call Romeo and Juliet laws. So if you are two people who are both minors, aka under 18, then there usually is kind of like, if you're this much older than the person, then they can't consent to sex with you. So it gets kind of complicated overall. But generally the concept is, if there is a large power imbalance due to age, then there cannot be consent.
And even speaking in, I guess, I'm sure we'll get into this when we get into institutional, we get into discussing institutional abuse, but even if they are 16 and the other person is someone in direct authority, whether that be a priest, pastor, teacher, police officer, whatever it is, how does power and consent work? How does that interplay work?
Yeah, so that kind of brings back to the stage of grooming where they like to create some sort of dependency between themselves and the person that they're grooming. Creating dependency creates a power imbalance. And when there is a power imbalance, consent can't be freely given. The concept of consent is supposed to be that somebody consents entirely voluntarily, free of consequences if they say no. If there's a huge power imbalance, you're never quite free of consequences for saying no, right? So that's kind of how it plays in, is that when there's a power imbalance, the ability of the person who's in the lower position of power to say no is compromised. So at the least, there should be kind of a presumption that there was no consent.
Kristi, I know a lot of people, we hear the word vulnerable adults, and I don't know if if people fully understand exactly what that means. I know, last few years I've been coming to a greater understanding of who a vulnerable adult is, especially if we're talking about like a teacher, a coach who has a student, or if it's, I think we would automatically assume someone who is maybe sick or unhealthy. But can you give us who a vulnerable adult would be, that definition?
Sure. So the term vulnerable adult, it doesn't come from state law. Really, the only place that I've heard that term used is in like canon law or Catholic law. The concepts that underlie it can be in regular secular law. It's one of those concepts that goes back to dependency. If an adult is vulnerable when they are in a large power imbalance between them and the abuser, and there is a large power imbalance when they are dependent on the abuser. But the concept itself doesn't really, at least I've not come across it in Louisiana state law or in federal law. It's really kind of something that I see. It's something that I only ever encountered when I'm doing cases against the Catholic Church. But I think that the concept makes sense. So, for instance, a lot of states will have laws that say that consent, or that it is presumed that there was no consent when you have, for instance, a therapist who engages in sexual activities with a patient. Because there's such a large power imbalance that we can presume that the patient was vulnerable to abuse by the therapist. And personally, I agree that's exactly true. I mean, the whole point of a therapist is to help you modify your thinking to see things differently than you otherwise would. And if they use that for their own gain to try to modify your thinking into someone who will do whatever they want sexually, that's an abuse of power. And I think the same thing is true regarding, although we don't have this law in Louisiana, but there are some states that have a law that say when there is a member of the clergy, it is presumed that they should not have sex with anybody who is one of their parishioners, because it should be presumed that there's such a big power imbalance there that we shouldn't assume that there was consent, because it would be so easy for a member of the clergy to take advantage of an adult, even an adult who has all of their faculties, all of their ability to make decisions. They're very reliant in a way on their spiritual leaders.
So a vulnerable adult has nothing necessarily to do with diminished mental capacity, but rather a descriptor of who that, or it describes that adult within that particular relationship. So someone can be a vulnerable adult with their spiritual advisor, but not necessarily a vulnerable adult anywhere else.
That's how I see it.
Yeah.
I believe the Catholic Church, I believe, defines it as somebody who has some sort of mental disability.
Okay.
This is not a term that we use anywhere else. Otherwise, we use that term relationally, like somebody is vulnerable to somebody.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true that certain people are vulnerable to a large set of people. Like, for instance, people who have disabilities are outrageously more likely to be sexually abused than people who don't. Particularly people who have disabilities that leave them nonverbal. They're much more likely to be sexually abused than people who are verbal. But the term vulnerable adult, personally, I don't think that it should be about whether or not they have some specific set of physical or mental circumstances going on that makes them vulnerable to everybody. I think it would make more sense to define it as they are vulnerable within certain relationships, because everybody is vulnerable within certain relationships. I'm vulnerable within certain relationships. Everyone is.
So does the term, and I'm just saying this now because I mean we've co-opted and used that term because it felt like something that, I don't know, it felt like something, right? I don't know if I realized that was something that might have been created through canon law and, those sorts of things. So is that a term that helps or hurts when discussing adults being sexually abused, especially within situations where there's different power dynamics? Because I mean, could I say that so-and-so is not a vulnerable adult and therefore it's probably consensual, right? Because she or he has no diminished capacity mentally or no physical disabilities and they can speak. I mean, is that a term that we should evaluate more whenever we're trying to advocate for survivors?
I think that it is a term that should be continually reevaluated as we learn more about how predatory people go about abusing others, and as we learn more about vulnerabilities in general. So yeah, I think it's something that should be reevaluated. I would hesitate to say that it hurts more than it helps, because I think anything that expands the definition of who is vulnerable to abuse helps, because I think that everybody is vulnerable to abuse in certain circumstances, and some people are master manipulators, and anybody is vulnerable to abuse by them. So I think that the term should be refined, and that's probably going to be a continual process. But I don't want people to take that to mean let's stop saying that adults are vulnerable.
Yeah. So reevaluate it. I'm sure applied applied in many cases so that it expands and helps survivors. But that's interesting. I didn't realize the origin of that. I really thought that was something that came from your side of the world.
I mean, I'm not a legal historian, so I can't promise that it's never been used before, but that's the only context where I encounter it. I can't think of a single law that I've ever come across that uses vulnerable adult as a term of art.
So, Kristi, and someone just sent me their latest questions and answers to safe environment training or Virtus training for the diocese. And in the questions and in the training, they used maltreatment of children rather than sexual abuse. So we know that language matters. Can you tell me or tell those who are listening, there is a survivor language per se, and why does it matter, and why is it important that we use correct terminology rather than trying to soften up things that maybe we just don't want to face or seem so icky, for lack of better words?
Yeah, that's a great question. I usually call it kind of sanitizing language. It makes it seem safe. And it's important for a lot of reasons. So one reason, the first thing that comes to mind, having read a lot of sexual abusers' personnel files, I've seen a lot of letters to someone else that said this person had some incidents of indiscretion with some people during this summer. And it just practically speaking, it gives truly no information. Enough to know that something happened, but not enough for anybody to use for any practical purposes. And if you contrast that against how people treat survivors of sexual abuse that report what happened to them, the survivors report what happened to them and they get asked every single detail. What were you wearing? Did they touch you from your left side or your right side? Did they have any moles on the middle of their finger? They get every single detail of a question. And oftentimes survivors will be asked the same set of questions 3 or 4 different times. And if they don't answer it exactly the same all of those times, then people say, "Oh, we got you, inconsistency." You can't do that with something that just says there was an incident of indiscretion. It's so vague that anything could be described as an incident of indiscretion, so it can't be used against them. It's a way of preventing people from knowing what actually happened.
And I think it's kind of crazy. One of the points I've really wanted to drive home, especially in the clerical sex abuse world, is that language actually hurts innocent people as well. Because if you just had a moment of awkwardness, you touch a child's head, you shouldn't have. Still a violation of safe environment. Just don't touch another child. But let's just say moment of awkwardness, you mess with his hair, and then in your file it says a moment of indiscretion. But at the same time, the priest who molested 4 kids, it also says a couple moments of indiscretion. If I read your file after figuring out what was in the other man's file, I'm going to assume that you are absolutely a child abuser. Just hands down, that's what I'm going to assume.
I completely agree. I think that having clear information helps protect innocent people as well as help rooting out people who are actually predatory.
And now in fully in your world, many survivors are kind of confused about their legal options. Can you, and I know we did this in the first podcast, which, by the way, just a little aside here, Kristi's first podcast, she discussed how sex abuse survivors get justice, and it was very, very well received. And still to this day, there's been people who have listened to it and thanked TentMakers and Resilience in the Shadows and thanked Kristi for what she's done. So I think it's important that we kind of do that again, just to hit anyone new who has not seen that episode yet, and please go back and see it. But can you help the listeners understand the differences between civil and criminal cases and the potential outcomes for each path? And I will add as well, also maybe the dispelling some of the stigma around survivors and their civil pursuits versus their criminal pursuits, because that's something that's very big in the survivor community. So how do civil and criminal cases differ?
Okay. So the biggest difference, just in simplest terms, is a criminal case, the outcome is they either get criminal punishment or they don't. In a civil case, the outcome is the survivor either gets money damages or they don't. They're two really separate legal systems. And one of them, in criminal law, that is where the state has a case against the perpetrator, or at this point, alleged perpetrator of the abuse. And they are trying to prove whether or not that person really did it. And if that person did do it, then they get sent to jail and they get criminal penalties. The standard of proof in a criminal case is, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt, which means more or less the jury has to be basically certain that the person committed the crime. And in a criminal case, the state can only go against the actual person, the human being that abused someone. In a civil case, it's different. The standard of proof, or the thing that you have to prove to win, it's referred to as more likely than not, or preponderance of the evidence. And so you have to prove that basically translates to 51%, just over the 50-yard line. And also in a civil case, you don't only have to sue, in fact, you don't even have to sue the perpetrator of the sexual abuse. You can sue an organization that enabled the abuser or protected the abuser, or for whatever reason is legally responsible for what the abuser did. So the benefits of bringing a civil case is that, to me, one of the reasons I love being an attorney who specializes in these types of cases is that when somebody is sexually abused in the context of the large organization, there's types of organizations that end up having abuse happen in them just over and over and over and over. And it's because they have bad policies and because they do a bad job enforcing policies. And so when a survivor brings a civil claim for sexual abuse, you get a chance to look at the policies of the organization. How did this organization end up attracting a child molester? And how did they end up taking actions that let the child molester start molesting children and get away with it? Why is this going on within their organization instead of some other organization? And so you really have an opportunity to make the world a lot safer through a civil case. In a criminal case, you can get one predator put in jail. In a civil case, you can get an entire organization to change their policies in a way that prevents children in the future from being abused.
So, Kristi, some survivors might think because maybe they're now 65, 70 years old, and the person who abused them might still be alive, but just a little bit older. Mm-hmm. And they may feel like, well, they're not going to go to jail. I can't tell the police. And so it's even pointless to bring about a civil suit. So how, or I guess, why would they want to pursue a civil suit if there is no way that that person can go to jail or be criminally prosecuted for the crime that they did? Maybe the statute of limitations, whatever, has passed.
Some of the reasons that I've heard from my clients for pursuing a civil case, even when the abuser has passed away or lives out of the country, or for whatever reason, the abuser cannot be held accountable. Some of the reasons that I've heard from my clients are, for one thing, it's very expensive to be a sexual abuse survivor. So if you file a civil case, like I said, the thing that you are asking a jury to give you is an amount of money to make up for the harm that you experienced. And people who have been survivors of sexual abuse, they incur a lot of expenses that they wouldn't have incurred if they weren't abused. For instance, something might happen at their job that triggers them to feel all the feelings that they felt when they were being sexually abused. And they might get fired because of how they respond, or they might quit because of how they respond, and that costs them money. Or they might need to pay money to have an extra sense of safety, to get a home security system. There's just so many expenses that are connected to being a survivor of sexual abuse. So a lot of times, just in a practical sense, it's not their fault that they got sexually abused, so it shouldn't be them who has to pay those expenses out of pocket. So that's one of the main reasons. Another reason that I've heard from a lot of my clients is when they were children, they didn't have the ability to fight for themselves. And some clients that I've had have gotten a lot of healing out of filing a case as an adult, because at this point in their life, they're ready to say, I now realize this wasn't my fault, and I didn't make this happen. Nothing about me made them sexually abuse me. And so a lot of clients that I've talked to have really felt a lot of healing because of the fact that they were able to kind of show up for themselves and say, I don't care what anyone else says. I know that this wasn't my fault. These other people should have done something different. This person shouldn't have abused me. And also this organization should have stopped putting this abuser alone with children.
Also, Kristi, I have one other question sort of related to that. If let's just say you're in you're maybe 35 years old and you are ready to come forward, do you make a police report?
I answer these questions for clients all the time. And I answer this question for people who aren't even my clients all the time. So a lot of times people call me and they want to know, should they go the route of trying to bring a criminal claim, or should they go the route of bringing a civil claim? It's a really hard question to answer, and it's really specific to the facts. So if the person who is the abuser has already passed away, there's very little that the police can do, right? Because like I said, in the criminal courts, the state and the police, they can only go against the person, like the human being that was the abuser. So if that person's already passed away, there's not a lot that can be done about that. But there are still, kind of in fact-specific ways, there are benefits to going to the police. In terms of talking to a civil attorney, there are also separate benefits for that, and they're very fact-specific too. One of the reasons that a lot of people that I talk to don't go to the police, though, even when the abuser is alive, is that the police have limited resources. They don't always, for whatever reason, do a large investigation when someone reports sexual abuse. I know that I was shocked when I first started doing these types of cases. I guess in a way I thought that what happens on CSI would be like how every case of child abuse is treated. Like, to me, in my head, I thought, whoa, a child is maybe being sexually abused. let's call in everybody. Let's call in every single resource we can find. In reality, that's not how it happens. They have limited resources, sometimes limited interest in using those resources. And so reporting to the police sometimes is a recipe for nothing happening and the person reporting being basically re-traumatized by the police. So there's very valid reasons for not reporting sexual abuse to the police. There's also valid reasons for reporting to the police. I mean, one of the valid reasons for reporting, even if they don't do anything at that time, is that when you report to the police, usually they will make some sort of written documentation that says this person has been reported for sexual abuse. And let's say later somebody else reports that same person for sexual abuse, then the police might look up, they might just kind of search that person's name and say like, oh, well, has this person ever been reported for something similar before? And if your report comes up, then the police are going to see, oh, well, 2 people have said that this person is a child molester. So they're going to take that more seriously then. So it's a really complicated determination whether or not to report sexual abuse, whether an adult or a child, to the police. It's less complicated deciding whether or not to go to the hospital. If going to the hospital to get evaluated is less complicated. There's a lot of reasons to do that, whether you're an adult or a child. For one thing, in Louisiana and in a lot of other states, going to the hospital to get an exam after having been sexually assaulted is free because it's covered by state money or by federal money. That's something that has been in place in Louisiana for, I want to say, about 10 years or so. And a lot of people think that if you go to the hospital to get, colloquially people call it like a rape kit. But it's really more like it's an exam, a sexual assault exam. And they are not just getting evidence to prove a rape. They're genuinely giving you medical care. So if you're raped by somebody, you have a chance of getting a sexually transmitted infection. They will give you medicines that prevent getting a sexually transmitted infection, and you can get those for free. They will take evidence, but they'll hold it for you until you decide if you even want that evidence to be given to the police or to be used in a case. There are very few downsides to going ahead and just going to the hospital or going to some sort of medical facility to get medical care, even if it's been years after. There's a type of nurse. It's called a SANE nurse, SANE, and they're trained to not re-traumatize survivors of sexual abuse. And one of the things that they talk about is that it's important to them to make sure that they treat the interaction as something where the survivor has choice over everything that happens to them. And it can be, in its own sense, kind of a healing experience for the survivor to get to have autonomy and choice over what is done to their body, what information is taken from it, what evidence is taken from it, what is done with that evidence. So in the best case of scenarios, if you have a very well-trained, sane nurse who does what they're trained to do, it can on its own be a healing experience.
Kristi, let's shift gears. I know we've already used a little bit of this language, institutional, systemic. So when discussing sex abuse, particularly in the Catholic Church, people are fine with saying that there are some sex abusers in the church or in that institution or that monastery or whatever. They might even be okay with saying that that there are some superiors or members of the hierarchy that have allowed for it, but they seem to really draw the line when you call it institutional, or when you say that there's certain systemic things present in that institution that might allow for these things to happen. Let's define some of these terms, I guess, and discuss them. So what is institutional abuse, and how does that happen?
Okay. I honestly can see why people are bristle at the term institutional abuse, because the whole institution isn't molesting a child. But there are institutions that, as a policy, enable abusers. And in those institutions, a lot of people get abused. And so if people bristle at the term institutional abuse, sure, fine. The whole institution isn't specifically abusing children, but they have a culture that promotes predatory people and enables them and shields them even when they get caught. So generally what people mean when they say institutional abuse is they mean that this is an institution where a lot of abuse happens because of the policies that are being used by that institution. But in kind of just practical terms, it means this is an institution that is really not doing what they could be doing to stop abuse. And in fact, a lot of the things they are doing is promoting abuse.
So, Kristi, some people would say, well, they have a lot of policies in place, so it can't be. Or as in, the church with safe environment, so that exists, and we're training our staff. Also, they might say, but we had, in the case of the Catholic Church, the Dallas Charter, so that's all been taken care of. So can you expand on possibly, we can talk about policies all day long, but if the policies are not followed, institutional abuse will happen. It's happened in the Catholic Church. We know the Boy Scouts had issues with it. I'm not real familiar with exactly what's happening with the Boy Scouts, but I think they've changed possibly not only their policies, but some of the ways they handle things. What are the differences in policy versus enacting your policy?
I could have a policy that says I'm the smartest person in the world, and it truly does not matter. I could just write it on a piece of paper. It means nothing if it's not true and if it's not enforced. A thing written on a piece of paper means nothing if it has no practical effect. The purpose of policies is to let everybody know, predators and non-predators, what is acceptable behavior. And people who are not predatory can help prevent abuse by following the policies. Because if non-predatory people follow the policies, then it stands out even more when predatory people break the policies. So policies are more or less useless without enforcement and without people following them. And the only way to make people follow them is to actually enforce them.
I know, Kristi, when you did the deposition for Father Michael Guidry, you asked him, how has your life changed after the Dallas Charter, I believe it was? And his response was that it had not changed. So how can we hold people accountable in these institutions, both the ones who are in authority and those who feel like they have no authority, maybe, just regular, like church-going Catholics? What can they do, aside from learning the terminology, but help keep people accountable?
I think it starts with the smallest things. You know, I heard some advice from a child abuse prevention expert one time that I think about at least once a week for the last 10 years, for sure. That if there is if an adult is acting in a way towards your child that makes you uncomfortable, that one of the best things you can do is just say like let's say an adult gave your child a gift that you didn't know about and it was special to them. And it makes you just have an icky feeling about it. One of the best things you could do is go to that adult and say, hey, I'm sure you're not abusing my child, but there's a thing that child abusers do is they give kids gifts and then it's kind of a secret. So, and I'm trying to teach my kid that that's not an appropriate way to act. So please don't give my kid any gifts anymore without clearing it with me first. If that person is a normal, not child abuser, if someone came to me and said that, I'd be like, yeah, absolutely not. I will never give your kid a gift again because I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I don't want to make the kid uncomfortable. And I don't want to do anything that perpetuates a system that lets child abusers get away with it. So if you can go to the person who did something that's making you uncomfortable or is a boundary violation in a nice way, if they are not a child abuser, they'll usually stop. If they are a child abuser, they'll usually find a new way to do that type of thing. Maybe they won't give gifts anymore, but they might start giving your kid a secret nickname, or they'll find a way around it. But it kind of goes back to something you were saying, Alex, that protecting people who aren't child abusers is important because nobody wants to be accused of that when they're not. And boundaries policies help protect people who aren't child abusers because if you're told to not do something, you can just stop doing it because you're not a child abuser. You're not grooming, so it's fine. You don't care to just stop it. But abusers want to keep going. They want to keep pushing boundaries all the time. And so one of the things that people can do that they don't do, and I see this constantly, people in organizations, they don't want to have an uncomfortable conversation.
Yes.
They don't want to say, that made me feel, I didn't like it when you interacted with my kid with that way. Or I didn't like it when you interacted with this other person's kid that way. We're not supposed to do that because no one wants to be a stickler or nitpicky or whatever. But when it comes to boundary violations, being nitpicky is a way to protect children. Because when you are nitpicky about the boundaries, it makes boundary violators stand out even more.
This brings up something, though. This isn't really legal, so this might just be Kristi Schubert, the not lawyer. This might be more opinionated. But one of the pushbacks that I get constantly when talking about safe environment, boundaries, and policies on an institutional level, number one, it seems to always be politicized, and I haven't yet found out in how that became a thing. But the accusation is always that in the fear of trying to, in fear, we've created just a bunch of monsters and we're trying to protect everyone, and there's abusers running around, and that it destroys normal human interaction. Now, I can say on this podcast for absolute certainty that when I go places, I'm a dad, I'm a grown up, I'm married. I have never in my life found myself in a situation where I'm in Walmart and I see a kid and I'm like, God, I need to touch that child. Even if it's innocent, I need to go tussle her hair. I've never felt that inclination. A child runs near me and I don't go, God, I need to touch that child. If I'm somewhere and a child falls down and hurts themselves, I will check on the child, pick the child up, and I'm immediately looking, where's a parent? Where's someone else? But I'm not in the back of my head going, oh my God, I don't want him to think I'm a pedophile. Let me not touch this child. It's just in the course of my normal interactions, I've never felt the need. When I was a youth minister for the Diocese of New Orleans, they knew that I had a rule, which was that we don't do hugs. When I told the kids that we're not hugging, no one fought me on it. The kids didn't go, oh God, no. I just really wanted to hug you. No one had said that. No one. But obviously there is, I guess, some sort of balance, right? Someone, your child waves at someone waves back. Well, then obviously that's, I don't know how you can, maybe you could classify that as a boundary violation. I don't think I would, but, what is there some balancing act that you're looking for when enacting these policies? And also is there some point where we just say, if you want to be a part of this organization and lead the choir, you never should have to touch a kid, and you just need to be okay with that? Like, is there at some point where we just go, no, stop it? Like, you're not. Actually, I think here's to clarify a little bit. People always bring up the old days. They go, back when, coach would slap your butt as you're walking through, and people were much more, and now these things are considered bad. I mean, is there a possibility that that back in the day we shouldn't have been touching anyone's butt? I
would say back in the old days is when the church is now saying that was when there was a lot of historical abuse.
Yeah.
That was the old days, is when there was when grooming, you just had free reign to groom. And so yes, for the people, because child abusers don't abuse every single child they meet.
Yeah.
They abuse some of the children that they meet. And giving people free reign to groom, I do not think helps overall the safety of children. I think that it's reasonable for people to say that there is some sort of trade-off. There are people who genuinely have good intentions and they care about children, and they might want to have a moment alone with a child to talk to them, and they might genuinely be a good person and their only intention is to help that child. But overall, because the risk of child sexual abuse is so high, and because giving people a wide latitude to do whatever they feel is appropriate is such a huge risk, I think that the trade-off of having boundaries is worth it. I think that overall it helps children be safer. And I think that when there are times that people who have good intentions genuinely want to help a child, by creating I don't think there's anything entirely wrong with an adult creating a connection with a child. That can be super beneficial. But it needs to be done not in secrecy. So if something like that happens, then there needs to be another adult brought in, and that other adult needs to have the facts disclosed to them about what's going on, what's being said, and maybe not even everything, but just in general, it is hard for groomers and abusers to operate when someone is looking at every single thing they're doing in terms of interaction with the children. I think it's an important question to ask, because there is going to be some sort of balance. We can't say no adult in the world can ever be in a room alone with a child, because then you could say, what if an adult comes across a child who's alone in a dark alley? Are you not allowed to save them because they're alone? Of course not. There's always some trade-offs and some boundaries. But we should always keep having these conversations. And I find that people who say things like, well, we can't all be treated as abusers, they often say that at such an early point in the conversation that you can tell that they just don't even want to have the rest of the conversation. They want to stop right now and say we should all be able to do whatever we want to and we should all be treated as trustworthy.
And I always say too, once again, of course, through what our family's been through, I guess I would consider myself a little more trauma informed. Sometimes I do pick up on some things that might be innocent, and that's my own stuff. But once again, it still always shocks me because I never feel like I am owed or need to. There's been like I said, no time where I've ever felt like in doing my job, even as a youth minister, in doing my job as a youth minister, in any volunteer work or just daily life, that I have felt needed to touch a child in any way, even in innocent, just pat on the head. I've never felt inclined to just go pat a child on the head, right?
I completely agree. People always think that, like, because I represent child sexual abuse survivors that I interact with children a lot. I don't. I almost never do. I don't do that because the last thing that a child who's been sexually abused needs is to be alone in a room with a person they don't even know. To the extent that they need to be evaluated by a professional, that is what I would hire a psychologist to do. I don't spend time alone with children, ever. I don't think I've done that actually in my entire time of being this type of attorney, because the number of times that it's actually necessary to be alone with a child as an adult is very small. And I don't know of any times where that would happen and you can't immediately tell somebody, hey, I had to do this thing where I was alone with a child for this reason. The disclosure is the thing that innocent people do, or people who aren't predators. They would say oh, I had to drive this child home because literally no one came to pick them up after this soccer game. But that's not something it's not a normal occasion. It's not happening so often that people are just having to touch children all the time.
Yeah.
So, Kristi, I know we're about to wrap up this podcast, but another term that I wanted to touch on, or two terms actually, because they kind of go together. Some people are not sure when to use victim, when to use survivor. In fact, sometimes people go, well, I just thought I was a victim. I've never heard the term survivor. What does that mean? So, or somebody's saying, well, I don't know, which one am I supposed to use? So if you could maybe expand on that a little bit, victim survivor terms.
Sure. So by default, I use survivor. And the reason I use survivor is because most of the people that I've represented have said that makes them feel better. They prefer to be called that. People say it's empowering to victims, survivors, however you want to say it. But the reason I use that term by default is because, from my experience, that's what most people who have experienced sexual abuse want to be called. I think that's the term I use by default. I do think it's important, though, to use, if you know somebody specific and they say, and I've had a few clients who have said, I actually prefer the term victim. If somebody prefers to use a certain terminology with their own experience, I think it's important to respect that. But from my experience, most people who experience sexual abuse prefer the term survivor because it highlights the fact that they've made it through it and that they are more than just that one experience that happened to them. They survived sexual abuse, but they aren't just a victim of sexual abuse and their life stopped there. And in general, there's a movement to reframe terminology that's used about sexual abuse cases in order to, kind of like we talked about in the beginning, to stop sanitizing the language. You'll often see in the newspapers, people will say that, you'll see the term underage girl or underage woman, but an underage woman is a girl, it's a child, right? Or you'll see child pornography, and there's a movement to change that. Instead of child pornography, which pornography is something that happens with presumably. I mean, there is actually a lot of abuse in the pornography world. But in theory, pornography is something that consenting adults do. But any time that you see a child involved in any sexualized image, that is a picture of a child being sexually abused, because a child cannot consent to being part of a sexual image. And so there's a movement to stop saying child pornography and start saying instead child sexual abuse material or child sexual abuse images. Because if someone is seeing a picture of a child in a sexual image, that child, you're looking at a picture of a child being abused. And so changing language, it both empowers the survivors themselves, and it also it makes it so that people can stop putting their heads in the sand about what's really going on.
And before we wrap up, in your experience with your clients, and I know you've touched on this, but I think it's important to just hear it again. How does bringing a civil case contribute to the healing of a survivor? And I want to also mention, you said something that other people had commented on when you first appeared, where you had pointed out a somewhat of a difference where in criminal court, it's the state going after the alleged abuser, but in civil case, it's the survivor who gets to initiate it and hire you and pick their warrior. You'd mentioned something of that sort. So can you touch on that as well?
Sure. I think if I remember correctly, what I said in the first time I was on the podcast was that when a survivor brings a civil case, the survivor is in the driver's seat.
Yes, that's exactly what you said.
It's their case. They get to decide when it stops, and it's about them. When there's a criminal case going on, it's about the state, and it's about the abuser's constitutional rights. And I'm all for constitutional rights, but in a criminal case, it is really about the abuser against the state. The survivor of the abuse, they are not a participant in the case. They are actually a witness to the case. So they're outside the process. But in a civil case, they are the person who started the case. They are in charge. And although we are still subject to what the judges rule, so we don't control the whole world just because we filed a civil case. But in a civil case, they get to decide when they are ready to stop. If they don't feel like going on, they get to decide what risks they want to take. It's their choices, and that's so important for people who have been sexually abused, because their choice was taken away from them when they were sexually abused. And being in the driver's seat gives them back some of that choice that they didn't have before. And if it doesn't work out and something happens that makes them decide, I just can't move forward with this case, then they're allowed to do that then.
And Kristi, you know how we end the podcast. Is there since we've had you on, the podcast has grown quite a bit. So I think, and I'm going to talk to our producer a little bit while I'm doing that, I think we've been shown in 10 countries. Yes, in 10 countries now. Our viewers have come from. Viewership has skyrocketed since your episode as well. We've grown. So there's a lot of people, like I said, who might not have even watched yours yet, but are listeners of the podcast. So what message do you have for survivors who are listening, and for those who might be listening, just they're looking for something to listen to, and then those who consider themselves allies and are looking to learn more and really actively try to change the culture? What message do you have for those groups of individuals?
So many messages. Okay, to boil them down, one I would say is that I know at least if you live in the United States, you are allowed to call an attorney and just ask them questions. You don't have to give them your name. You don't have to give them the abuser's name. You can just ask questions of an attorney to know what your rights are. And when you do that, that is still attorney-client privileged information. I really want people to know that it is free to call an attorney to learn what your rights are. Most of the people who call me, they, for whatever reason or not, like some of the cases I end up being able to represent them, some of the cases I can't, some of the cases they decide they don't even want to bring a case. All of those people who called me, it's attorney-client privileged. I can never tell anybody what they said, and also none of those people have ever paid me a dime. I think it's really important for people to know that calling a sexual abuse attorney to learn your rights is free, and there are not any downsides other than just that it's always difficult to tell your story to a new stranger. But I think it's important for people to know that they can call an attorney and it is free, and they can learn, is this a case I could even bring? Because it's a lot of times that when people call me, it'll be the first time that they've told anybody about what happened to them. And they might think that they have to pay somebody money to say whether or not they'll take the case. And I don't want anybody to feel like they have to pay money to figure out if their case can be pursued. They have not only a right, but just practically, it's not that hard to call an attorney and say, is this even a case that someone can pursue? I also think it's important for them to know, one of the things that I've noticed the most is that a lot of people who call me, they are always scared to tell me that when they were sexually abused, they didn't fight back physically. And I've noticed, just kind of, I want to say this as a PSA, that most people don't physically fight back to being sexually abused. Most don't. And I want everybody who is out there that's been sexually abused to know that that's normal. The fact that if you were sexually abused and you didn't physically fight back, that's normal. You're in the norm. That does not mean that I wouldn't believe you about your story. It doesn't mean that other people wouldn't believe you about your story. Most people don't physically fight back. That's just how brains work. And I know that there are thousands of people out there thinking that they're the only one who didn't fight back. And that's not true. Most people, men, women, 5-year-olds, 70-year-olds, most people don't physically fight back. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you weren't abused.
Kristi, thank you so much for joining us again. Thank you for joining us and giving us another impactful episode of Resilience in the Shadows. We hope that today's discussion with Kristi Schubert has provided clarity and insight on justice, healing, survivor advocacy. And Kristi, a heartfelt thank you for coming on again, sharing your expertise, and for your dedication to helping survivors heal.
Thanks for having me again.
Thank you for joining us for this impactful episode of Resilience in the Shadows. We hope today's discussion with Kristi Schubert has provided clarity and insight on justice, healing, and survivor advocacy. A heartfelt thank you to Kristi for sharing her expertise and her dedication to supporting survivors. Her work reminds us how vital it is to stand with survivors on their healing journey. If you'd like to connect with Kristi or seek her legal expertise, you can reach her at the Lamothe Law Firm in New Orleans. Contact her toll-free at 877-249-6801 or locally at 504-608-0947. We also want to remind you of the vital work being done by TentMakers of Louisiana. To learn more about our mission to support survivors, educate communities, and advocate for justice, please visit www.TentMakers.la. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories of resilience and healing. If you have a story of courage and resilience or know someone whose journey would inspire our audience, we invite you to contact us through our website. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, stay resilient and remember that even in the shadows, there is light.